Hello, I'm Chris Van Daalen, and I'm honored today to be presenting to the Living Future Institute's global network of collaborative leaders and living building ambassadors. Thanks so much for having me. I work for a nonprofit based in Olympia, Washington called the Northwest Eco Building Guild. We're a three-state regional alliance of architects, builders, contractors, and others who share a strong commitment to transforming the built environment to long-term sustainability through education. And to that end, we've developed, and I manage, a program called the Code Innovations Database, which is really trying to bridge the gap between what is currently recognized and allowed by the building codes and what our Living Building Challenge and other advanced building projects are trying to achieve. Now, I should also mention that I'm on the steering committee for the South Sound Branch Collaborative in Tacoma and Olympia, Washington, and our two organizations have enjoyed a long and productive partnership here in the Pacific Northwest. This presentation represents the latest chapter of that partnership, which I hope will take us into some exciting new directions. So let's get right into it, shall we? You know, when I think about green building innovators, folks like yourselves, you're my heroes because you're a virtual research and development department for tomorrow's building industry, pushing the envelope with new designs, materials, and technologies that make it possible today for people to live and work in buildings that are healthier, more sustainable, and contribute to the communities in which they're built. In the process, you're pushing through code barriers and developing new policy solutions that are pioneering new compliance paths, making buildings such as these possible. And in turn, that's helping drive building codes forward to a more advanced state where we want our buildings to go. Yet, far too often, innovators face code and regulatory barriers that can slow or even stop a project from going forward. You know, if we want our innovations to be adopted more broadly, we have to get beyond fighting for each and every precedent, every permit, and get to a place where policies are really encouraging living buildings and other advanced building methods to be the norm rather than the exception. But we're nowhere close to that yet. So how are we going to bridge the gap between what codes currently recognize and what we want them to do? Well, about 5 years ago, a group of us got together in Thurston County, Washington, where I live, and we, recognizing this problem, we came up with this idea for a code innovation database that would help move things forward more quickly. What it is an online resource that's designed to make it easier to build green. You know, each innovation has a champion that fought hard to get that permit and get the project built, but far too often when those projects are completed, the precedent that is being set and the lessons learned are lost to history because they're so those folks are focused on getting their building built, not teaching everyone else how to do it. And so we decided to take up the charge and try to document as many of these permitting precedents and policy solutions that innovators have pioneered so that others can more easily follow in their footsteps. It's available online at www.codeinnovations.org, and I hope you'll check it out. Now, the Living Future Institute has its own set of research and advocacy tools, which are very valuable for moving this forward. As you may know, ILFI has done some seminal research here in Washington State, identifying code, regulatory, and systemic barriers affecting living building projects. And then they use that information to advance policy solutions, such as the City of Seattle's Living Building Challenge Pilot Ordinance. Then last year, ILFI released its Advocacy Toolkit, which I'm sure many of you are using, with the basic idea that if we have this great research, knowledge, and innovation, we need to be organized and strategic in how we advocate to advance building codes and policy solutions that will make living buildings and other high-performance buildings the norm rather than the exception. But before we get into the details of code innovations and policy innovations, let's take a moment to step back and put things in perspective just a little bit. In the U.S., at least, when we talk about code minimums, what we're referring to is really the bare minimum of what would be considered safe, habitable, and legal for human occupation. And if we want to go beyond that, building codes really don't tell us what buildings should aspire to be. For that, we need to look to the certification systems, such as the LEED certification, that will move us toward better building practices and high-performance green building. But LEED itself doesn't really achieve what we might consider sustainable or a net zero impact on the environment and human health. For that, we need to go to the Passive House Standard or net zero certification. But really, with the Living Building Challenge, what we're after is to go beyond that point to enable what we might consider truly restorative or regenerative development, buildings that actively improve the health and integrity of the ecosystems where they're built, as well as the health and happiness of the people who live and work in them. It stands to reason that if the living building challenge is where we want most buildings to go, we have to really understand where we're starting from. So let's take a moment to look at the purpose of building codes and how they're working. Codes are meant to safeguard public health, safety, and general welfare from hazards attributable to the built environment. And as we can see from this chart, back in the early 1900s, when building codes began to be adopted and implemented more broadly in the United States, deaths from house fires and structural collapse and waterborne disease from buildings really dropped off precipitously to where about the middle of the century, we achieved a very low level of hazard from individual buildings. And so we can see building codes are really important and they work well at what they're meant to do. But now, as we look forward, we are realizing more painfully every day that new hazards attributable to the built environment have emerged, such as climate change, the prevalence of toxic materials in our buildings that aren't really attributable to individual buildings, but are more systemic problems. And we really have to ask the question, how will the codes evolve to address these new risks? Because we can see that building codes are very effective at addressing fire safety, structural integrity, water quality issues attributable to individual buildings, but much less effective at addressing the risks to the rest of society that are attributable to the built environment. More generalized risks such as climate change, depletion of resources, and loss of habitat and biodiversity. And these hazards really affect society as a whole and are externalized, not paid for by the individual building occupants, but by the rest of society. So we have to really understand, if we want to accelerate this process, we have to understand how building codes are going to evolve. There are really three ways in which codes are evolving to address these broader societal risks from the built environment. The first of which is incremental change driven by policy. Secondly, we have voluntary certification systems that are really modeling what the next generation of building codes are likely to be. And finally, and most importantly for this presentation, we have the innovators themselves driving codes forward by busting through code barriers and implementing solutions that can be adopted more broadly. So first, though, let's take a quick look at incremental change driven by policy. Here in Washington State, we have greenhouse gas reduction goals that are driving building codes forward. So every 3-year cycle, the Building Code Council adopts energy efficiency improvements in the code that are intended to reduce building energy use by about 19% per year. So over time, we'll be moving steadily toward our goals of reducing emissions by 80% by the year 2050. Then, of course, we have the voluntary certifications, which are modeling what future codes might look like. For example, the International Green Construction Code, which was adopted by the ICC in 2012, was really based largely upon the LEED certification checklist. The Living Building Challenge, as I mentioned previously, was used to develop the Living Building Pilot Ordinance in the city of Seattle, which allows for extra flexibility and support for projects that are pursuing the LBC certification. Passive House is another standard that has been used to affect policy change. In the city of Brussels, Belgium, they have a Passive House equivalent building code for all new commercial construction. And then closer back to home here in Seattle, we have the 2030 district, which is calling all building designers and managers and developers to reach for a higher standard of energy and water efficiency. So these are examples of where voluntary systems are really modeling what is likely to be implemented down the road in actual building code requirements, but it's still voluntary. Beyond that, what I find most exciting is that innovators themselves are driving codes forward by pushing through these code barriers. And so, fortunately, here in the United States, our building codes explicitly allow for such innovation. Every code contains a provision that says that this code is not intended to prevent the installation of any material, design, or method of construction not specifically prescribed by this code, which means that alternative materials and methods can be approved as long as they show that they meet or exceed the intent of the code. And to do that, they have to provide the required testing, certification, and other documentations that could be used to justify that decision. And ultimately, innovations have to be approved by the code official in the jurisdiction having authority. So The Code Innovation Database is capturing that excitement by documenting an individual project that has succeeded in pioneering and innovation, and make that information available for building officials, builders, and other stakeholders so that they can share that information and help to hopefully accelerate the replication of successfully permitted innovations and proven solutions. So let's look now at some of the specific innovations that are documented in our Code Innovations database. Of course, many of you are already familiar with the Bullitt Center in Seattle. It has a number of innovations, and it was really the first project permitted using the additional flexibility and authorities granted under the Living Building Pilot Ordinance. This exemplary building contains a number of groundbreaking green building innovations that were also code innovations. I won't have a chance to go into all of them today, but I want to hit a few highlights, starting with the solar array, which for a 6-story building in a very small urban lot, in order to meet their net zero energy imperative, they actually had to build a solar array that was larger than the footprint of the building itself. So it overhangs the sidewalk below, which is the public right-of-way. Normally that wouldn't be allowed except for an awning or canopy on the front of a retail store, but they actually used the awning code within the building code as a template for approving this larger than normal solar array. The Bullitt Center is also the first 6-story building in the United States served only by composting toilets, and you can see here the composters in the basement. They also treat all of their gray water on site using a constructed wetland green roof on the 3rd floor exterior of the building, with an overflow outlet that drains down to this infiltration basin, which is also in the public right-of-way. Again, normally that wouldn't be allowed, but by partnering with the city and the Department of Transportation, they were able to gain approval for this beautiful installation of a drain field treating both gray water and stormwater in the public right-of-way. The Bullitt Center also has a potable drinking water system served by rainwater harvested off the roof and the solar panels. You know, that's more and more common in the United States for residential applications, but for a public building to use rainwater, it required a lot more hoop jumping in order to become their own drinking water utility. And there's still actually a few snags in that process, and they're waiting for final approval to turn on the rainwater for potable use system. Another Living Building Challenge project documented in the Code Innovations database is the Birchie School Living Science Wing, a really stunningly beautiful environmental classroom that serves middle school age children in a private school in Seattle. It has a number of really awesome green building features, including a gray water reuse system that captures all the water from the hand washing sinks to irrigate this living wall within the building. And as you can see here, the children are learning about the environment while seeing a green building in action. Later on, they'll head downstairs and proudly use their composting toilet system. And then they also have a system for rainwater harvesting for potable use. As you can see, they have a cistern outside, and then that water is channeled in through the purification system, which has all the necessary equipment with carbon filters and UV sanitation to treat the water to a potable standard. But unfortunately, as you well know, the red list requires that no chlorine be used within the building. And so they actually haven't turned this system on because they didn't want to break the red list requirement and achieve their Living Building Challenge status. You might want to note that the Bullitt Center actually has the same problem, but they actually sought and were afforded an exemption from the Living Building Challenge because not using chlorine would actually make their system illegal. And that's one of the only things that can be used to exempt a requirement of the Living Building Challenge while still achieving the challenge. So another project in the Code Innovations database is the Birch Case Study House in Bellingham, Washington. This is a project pursuing PETAL certification under the water and energy imperatives. Is also pursuing Passive House standards. It includes a number of different advanced green building systems that required alternative approval and compliance. For example, their Sandon CO2 heat pump water heater, an environmentally superior system, but unfortunately doesn't have the UL listing that's required for all equipment like this to be approved under U.S. building codes. The system does have CE listing and is approved for use in Europe, but unfortunately, U.S. codes don't recognize that certification. They also have a fully self-sufficient rainwater harvesting for potable use system with all the fancy purification. As well, their on-site wastewater is treated through an interior graywater planter solarium, which I think you saw a picture of earlier at the beginning, and with composting toilets, they are able to divert all of their water on site, and really was a groundbreaking project because they were the first home that I'm aware of that is able to go off-grid and not be required to put in the expensive city water and sewer hookups, and instead we're able to invest that money into the advanced water systems in the home. So the beautiful home of Anne and Gord Baird in Vancouver, British Columbia, they affectionately refer to as their EcoSense home, was the first load-bearing cob home in North America. Technically, the cob itself is not load-bearing, but they have an internal cross-bracing structure within the wall that provides the structural integrity. They also installed moisture meters in the wall to show to the code official that not only was this load-bearing cob building structurally sound, but also energy efficient and could deal with moisture issues in an open diffusion wall system. As you can see in the picture, they also have solar and a number of other great features, which I won't go into, but really beautiful home, and again, a Living Building Challenge certified project. Another groundbreaking project, not a living building project, but innovative, very innovative nonetheless, is the historic renovation and energy retrofit of the historic Supply Laundry building. This is an 108-year-old building in the heart of downtown Seattle's urban core, rapidly developing South Lake Union area. And so in order to preserve this remarkable historic building and all of its character, they had to develop a new flexible compliance path because the Seattle Energy Code is so rigorous that in order to renovate it, they would have had to pretty much destroy all of the historic character of the building. The old windows, the beautiful masonry facade, the interior timber framing. In order to avoid that and to preserve those characters, they pioneered a brand new outcome-based compliance path within the Seattle Energy Code. And to my knowledge, this is the only project and the only code in the nation that includes an outcome-based energy compliance path. I think this is more common in Europe and in other parts of the world, but here in the U.S., it's still very much in its infancy, which is why we wanted to include it in the Code Innovations database. I knew I couldn't give this presentation without at least giving a nod to the remarkable work of eco-districts, and in this case, the District Energy Project, again in the downtown Seattle area, where the Weston Data Center, which is a tall building filled with computers that put off tons of waste heat, energy, that heat is being captured and transferred through thermal hot water piping using the public streets to transfer it from one building to the next. In order to get that approved, they had to work with numerous different agencies and use innovative technologies to get it done. Now, this project's not yet in the database. I hope to get it there soon, but eco-districts help us to understand the need to jump scale sometimes to get the optimal effect of the innovative technologies if we want to reduce our energy use dramatically. So to kind of wrap this up, I hope that you all will take advantage of this new resource we've established, the Code Innovations database, which is really intended to bridge the gap between what's allowed and what we want to be allowed for living building and other advanced high-performing green building projects. We can use the database to search and find successful precedents for permitting compliance that didn't meet the normal building code. That way we don't have to always reinvent the wheel, and all those lessons learned can be captured and transferred from one innovator to the next. Obviously, with this information available, we can have better collaborations, sharing information, and maybe the most important part is that this information can be used to advocate for policy and code changes that will allow for living buildings to become the norm rather than the exception on how buildings are designed and constructed. So now I want to put the challenge back to you to help us build the Code Innovations database and make it the most valuable, highly used, and sought after resource available on the internet. As you may have noticed, a lot of our case studies are from the Northwest, but we're branching out quickly and including projects from all around the world. So please contribute what you know by submitting your innovative project or an adopted code or policy through our website at www.codeinnovations.org. You can help us by improve the database. We're looking for feedback on what will make it more valuable and interesting. And to that end, we're going to host a series of focus groups in early 2017, which I invite you to join. You can also help us spread the word to your networks. I encourage you to subscribe to our blog. It's called Gems of Innovation, as well as our Facebook posts, and share. Finally, the call that ILFI has already given you is to be an advocate for innovation. Use the database and the ILFI research tools and other tools to engage a local jurisdiction and try to get some of these advanced codes and permitting processes adopted by your local jurisdiction, either in the States or other countries. So whether you're working with the Living Building Challenge, Passive House, or some other advanced certification system or project, I want to know what regulatory barriers have you overcome? What policies have you gotten adopted? And share that information with us so we can put it into the Code Innovations database. And so with that, I conclude and invite you to stay in touch. There's my contact information. And of course, you can check us out on the web at www.codeinnovations.org. I really want to thank the organizers here at Living Future Institute's Global Collaborative Network for giving me the opportunity to present to all of you today. And I look forward to an engaging conversation here going forward here for the rest of this call. Thank you.